You've probably heard the phrase, or might even have heard me say, that reality is stranger than fiction, or the truth is stranger than fiction. Sometimes reality is much, much darker than fiction. For over 2 decades, Fred and Rose West were the king and queen of kidnapping, torture, sexual sadism, incest, murder in their British home at 25 Cromwell Street. Victims were carted into their home and then the sex dungeon beneath the eyes of neighbors and completely unknown to law enforcement. The quiet street, the low lights, the charming, average, and painfully normal-looking family never raised any suspicion. Their own daughter Heather would become their murder victim at the age of 16, and not the only child that they would kill. But it was Heather's death that would eventually expose the House of Horrors. Her monstrous parents had strangled her, beat her, decapitated her, and her mutilated body was found buried under the garden beneath their home. And as if that wasn't enough, police were dumbfounded when they found 8 other bodies buried in the garden and the cellar. More bodies would be found elsewhere. Despite the shocking details of their crimes, Fred and Rose West aren't incredibly well known in America, so who were these monsters? Fred was born in the village of Much Markel in 1941 into a home of egregious sexual violence and incest. Fred's father would have sex with his sisters, believing it to be his right, and Fred himself would lose his virginity to his mother and also have sex with his sisters. Rose's childhood was shockingly similar to Fred's, like depressingly so. Rose was born in 1953 to a father who was a paranoid schizophrenic and a mother who was clinically depressed. Rose's father started having sex with her at an early age, and she in turn began molesting her younger brother, Graham, when he was 9 and she was 13. 2 broken and horribly abused people would meet in 1969 and leave a trail of pain and carnage in their wake. Most often, those who are abused grow up to make sure they never do that to someone else. Some people make it their mission to fight for other victims. Fred and Rose took what had been done to them and they not only perpetuated it, but they did so much worse. Today we're truly, truly on the highway to hell's door and our first international episode of Highway to Hell. Happy Tuesday, Hellions. Welcome back to Highway to Hell, the travel and true crime podcast. My name is Monty, rocker, fitness geek, podcast auntie. Also recovering from chronic migraines, and I'm alive again. So before I make some announcements, as if that intro wasn't enough, I'm going to give kind of the unusual trigger warning. Obviously, this is a true crime podcast. Things are violent. They're gory. This episode is especially brutal. It's murder, it's incest, and it's so much sexual assault. Like this, I cannot believe that this couple is real. So I just want to let you know, this one's going to be real dicey. If you happen to listen to podcasts around your kids, I would not recommend little ears hearing this. This is one of those true crime stories that it reaches a level of depravity that doesn't seem possible. The only other person I can think of that's anywhere in the ballpark is the Toy Box Killer, which we'll cover later on. I just want to give people a heads up if you listen to this in public or at work or around kids, put your headphones in. It's going to get spicy. Some announcements this coming week. Highway to Hell is going to have its own social media and email. I've decided to separate the podcast from my music and my fitness pages. So once I have those up and running, I'll make an announcement here and on those pages so you can see that. I just want to basically have like a little hub for my true crime community, give things a little bit more space. Also for today, the travel destination is London, but the crimes actually happened a little bit outside of London. I considered doing Jack the Ripper, but wanted to do something a little different. Obviously, Jack the Ripper has been covered so much, But I am going to talk about Jack the Ripper a little bit in the travel portion. So go to London. That's where you're going to fly in. Enjoy your stay. And if you want to visit the tiny villages that these crimes happened, you can. Grab a drink. This one is heavy. I sound like a chronic smoker because not only have the cicadas attacked Tennessee, but the allergies are so bad. I'm meeting with my doctor tomorrow for an intervention. So you get the sultry jazz, Monty. Let's jump in. So most serial killers are notoriously male. Usually they work alone, which makes sense because when you're committing crimes, it's usually not helpful for someone to know that you're committing those crimes. Now, sometimes serial killers work in pairs, usually with one being submissive, and it is highly unusual to have a serial killing couple, a romantic couple, especially when both members of the relationship are both sexual sadists. So a lot of serial killers were married, but their partners had no idea what they were doing. And there has been some instances of like a girlfriend being involved, but to a much lesser degree. This is an extremely rare instance where a romantic couple were actual predators together. Fred and Rose West have to have been a 1 in a billion couple. Like, what are the chances that two people would be raised in families of extreme incest, that those two families would live in the same region, and that those two people would meet, be sexually attracted to each other, and want to continue the cycle of abuse to extreme levels together? Rose was particularly confusing for law enforcement due to the ongoing belief that women just couldn't be as murderous and sexually violent. And for the most part, that's true. Globally, 78% of murderers are men, and sexual crimes are over 98% male. And this is worldwide. Up to 98% of cases of child rape are perpetuated by men. There's a reason that women choose the bear. We know what's up. These statistics show how highly unusual the pair was, and the equal participation of both parties made this a case that rocked Britain. And I imagine it will give you some creepy crawlies as well. It definitely did for me. A lot of times in these episodes, I focus a lot on just the crimes or the hauntings and the stories directly impacting the story. But for this episode, I'm going to give a little bit more history of each of the killers because I think it's such a critical piece of what Fred and Rose would later do in life and who they would become. On September 29th, 1941, Fred West is born in Muchmarcle, which is a tiny village about 120 miles west of London. Muchmarcle was extremely rural, still is, and was considered by many people to be a little different than the rest of England. That's read backwards as fuck. Think deep cousin marriage, rural America. Did you know that about 20 states in the U.S. still allow for child marriage? That was a disturbing factoid I came across on my research here. Fred West's parents met at a fair in Muchmarcle in 1939 in the needlework stall, which I'm sure was riveting. She was 16. His mother at the time, Daisy Hill, lived with her parents and was referred to as not conventionally attractive, which in these particular sources seems to mean she was really unattractive. They were just trying to be polite. And her family was known for being strange, odd, and with the information we have now, probably very incestuous. They were married very rapidly and moved into a brick cottage with no running water or electricity, which was common for the area at the time. Daisy immediately got pregnant, but the baby was born prematurely and died shortly after. She got pregnant again and gave birth to Fred West. Daisy was obsessed with her new baby boy from day one. She would cuddle with her baby to the exclusion of her husband and had a strange obsession with her child. After quickly having 6 kids, the West family became very impoverished, even by rural England standards. They would survive off produce they could raise, apples that would fall to the ground from apple trees, and eggs from their chickens. Eventually, finances would improve enough for them to get a bigger home with 3 bedrooms. And it was in this newer, larger home that Fred West's tragedy of a childhood would really change. Fred West started primary school and really struggled. He was described as dim and dirty. Poor kid. He would get in trouble constantly, and his parents would never enforce discipline. In fact, his mother would berate the teachers if they punished him. I know that triggers some feelings in my teacher listeners. From what I hear, parents are rough these days. Around the time that Fred hit puberty, Daisy was still obsessed with her firstborn son, and her obsession became sexual. No exact dates are given, but by the early 50s, Daisy West was molesting her son Fred and likely her other two sons, pushing on a really messed up family tradition. Fred would let police know after his eventual arrest that he lost his virginity to his mother. On November 29, 1953, Rose Letts was born to another completely insane family. While Rose's family and parents were more educated, her father was a professional soldier, Rose's mother, who was also a Daisy, was a nurse. There was a better financial outlook for the family, but they were just as depraved. Daisy and Rose's father, Bill, met when they both relocated away from London to escape the Blitz of World War II. Now, I'm a huge history buff, particularly World War II, so I wanted to give like a brief little note on the Blitz. So the Blitz is short for Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. It was a significant campaign of aerial bombardment conducted by Nazi Germany against the United Kingdom during World War II. This campaign took place from September 7th of 1940 to May 11th of 1941. It was a crucial part of the Battle of Britain and aimed to weaken British resistance by targeting civilian and industrial centers, particularly in London and other major cities. The Blitz was initiated following the failure of the German Luftwaffe, their air force, to achieve air superiority over the Royal Air Force, the RAF, in the Battle of Britain. Unable to defeat the RAF directly, Adolf Hitler and his military strategists shifted their focus to bombing civilian areas to break the British people's morale and force the government to sue for peace. The campaign also aimed to disrupt war production and supply chains by targeting industrial and logistical infrastructure. The Blitz began on September 7, 1940, with a massive air raid of London that involved around 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters. The bombing raids continued almost nightly, while London being bombed for 57 consecutive nights. That's 57 nights in a row. And I will say, I'm not a fan of a lot of things happening in the U.S. right now, but I am deeply thankful that I have never experienced something like this or like what's going on in the Ukraine. The attacks later expanded to other cities, including Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, and Sheffield. London, though, bore the brunt of the Blitz. The city suffered extensive damage, with target areas being reduced to rubble. It's actually amazing that so many famous landmarks we associate with London that I'll talk about today are still standing. Approximately 43,000 civilians were killed and around 139,000 were injured across the UK. Over 1 million homes were completely destroyed or damaged in London alone. Significant landmarks, including St. Paul's Cathedral and the House of Parliament, were hit but survived largely due to firefighting efforts. The bombings caused severe disruptions to the daily life and economic activities of local Londoners. Factories, docks, railways, and warehouses were frequently targeted, hampering war production and supply lines. Remember that before the U.S. entered the war, the UK was the superpower that Germany was most worried about. Despite the devastation, British morale remained resilient. The population adapted by using underground stations and other shelters to protect themselves during air raids. The government also implemented extensive civil defense measures, including blackouts, air raid wardens, and the establishment of the Home Guard. The Blitz ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Instead of breaking the British spirit, it galvanized the population and strengthened their resolve to resist Nazi aggression. The failure of the Blitz marked a stunning turning point in World War II, as it demonstrated the limitation of aerial bombardment in achieving decisive strategic outcomes without the support of ground operations. All that is fancy dictionary speak for you can't win just by air. You got to have people on the ground. Let's go back to the Letts family. When Rose's mother met Bill, she quite frankly thought he was boring. He never smoked, he never drank, he hated profanity. Turns out, he worked so hard to control his public behavior because he was hiding some very dark secrets and severe mental illness. I think of this actually every time I meet someone who is super hateful, like whether it's homophobia or they hate profanity or they shame people all the time, it's usually those people that are doing the most messed up stuff. I remember growing up, there's one family that comes to mind, I'm not going to say their name, but they were I grew up in a conservative evangelical home. This particular family was so rigid, so conservative, so all the things you can think of. And then it turns out later, I get in touch with one of the daughters years and years later, and incest was rampant in that family. And I was like, oh, well, them. However, Daisy and Bill started dating. They also married quickly, and it was only after the marriage that Daisy found out that Bill was a diagnosed schizophrenic who refused to take medication. He was also a physically and sexually abusive psychopath. I really hate how common this is, especially for women. Abusers like this, they reel you in, make you think you're amazing and loving, and they're so here for you. And as soon as you get married or as soon as you get pregnant women are so in danger because that's a big turning point where they think they have you trapped. Then the abuse comes out. And if you saw the video this week of Diddy and Cassie in that hotel, you see it playing out. And this woman probably started dating him thinking that he was amazing and loving and he understood her and he understood her career. And if that man was willing to do that in a public hotel, I can only imagine what he was doing behind closed doors. So Bill was overly controlling. He demanded a squeaky clean house 100% of the time. And if it wasn't, he would beat the shit out of her. And she was not allowed to speak to anyone, male or female, even neighbors. It wasn't long before Bill was regularly beating his wife and his children. The children were so bruised so often they would no longer be allowed to play outside so that the neighbors wouldn't see their black eyes and their bruises. He would beat them with copper pipes, punch them in the face, pour boiling water on them. Complete fucking psycho. Daisy falls into postpartum depression after their 5th child, and obviously like years of abuse, I imagine, and has a complete nervous breakdown in 1953. She was treated with electroconvulsive or electroshock therapy. Yikes. Let's talk about electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, for a second. Also known as electroshock therapy, it was widely used in psychiatric, that's a word, treatments in 1950s. It involved passing electrical currents through the brain to induce seizures. ECT was first introduced in 1938 by an Italian neurologist, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini. By the 1950s, it was a popular treatment for severe that word is tripping me up today. Psychiatric, not psychiatric. Psychiatric conditions, including depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. In the 1950s, ECT was often administered without adequate anesthesia or muscle relaxants. This led to violent seizures, causing physical trauma to patients. This trauma included bone fractures, especially in the spine and the limbs. Patients also experienced dislocated joints and severe bruising. The procedure placed a considerable strain on the cardiovascular system, sometimes resulting in cardiac arrhythmias and other heart-related issues. One of the most common side effects was memory loss, particularly retrograde amnesia, loss of the memories right before treatment. Patients often reported gaps in their memory spanning months or even years. Many patients experience lasting cognitive deficits, including difficulties with attention, concentration, and problem solving. Yeah, and imagine an unregulated electrical current going through your brain. We'll do that. The extent of cognitive impairment varied, but it was a significant concern. The traumatic nature of the treatment often led to increased anxiety and fear among patients, and there was this significant stigma and fear associated with ECT, and honestly, associated with mental health struggles in general. This is still very much in the area where therapy makes you weak. You need to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get over it, which is not how biology works. While ECT was intended to alleviate symptoms, there were instances where it worsened psychiatric conditions. Some patients experienced increased depression, anxiety, or full psychosis following treatment. There was a lot of other issues with ECT. Patients were often subjected without informed consent, leading to a lot of ethical concerns. Coercion and forced treatments were not uncommon, especially in industrial settings. This immediately made me think of the season of American Horror Story Asylum, like just fry people into complete vegetables. So Daisy Letts, Rose's mom, completed 6 ECT treatments. Here's the thing though. During those treatments, she got pregnant with Rose and completed her treatments while pregnant. The ECT left Daisy cognitively impaired and still depressed like before, and it's speculated that Rose's cognitive ability was impacted since she was in the womb while these treatments were happening, which is crazy to me. I cannot believe that a doctor would allow a pregnant woman to undergo this treatment. Rose was known to aggressively rock herself into semi-consciousness. She slept frequently, did not interact with other children, and did terribly in school. She could barely spell even the simplest of words. And honestly, looking at baby pictures of her, she's super cute, but you can tell that she's not fully there. Like, she is not dealing with a full deck of cards. I still can't believe the doctors did that. That's just wild. She couldn't spell the simplest of words even by the time she left school, but was favored by her father and was the only child that wasn't beaten, but he would abuse her in other ways later on. All right, so let's pop over to Fred again for a second. As a teen, he was in a severe motorcycle accident that would damage his skull and leave him in a coma for a week. He came out with a permanent limp and a scarred face, and people that knew him would say that this accident permanently changed him. And there's a lot of research to suggest that serious head injuries, particularly to the frontal lobe, which controls our impulse control, sexual behavior, and our moral compass, can increase the likelihood of violence and aggression, mental health disorders, and crimes like rape and serial murder. And when your compass and your impulse control is as terrible as Fred's already was, I can't imagine that the head injury helped. Seriously, the life of these two reads like a movie script where someone just went too far, where they bring it in to like some agents or something and they're like, I have this idea. And people are like, that's crazy. Nobody's ever going to believe that. That's how the story feels. By 1960, rumors were spreading that Bill Letts, Rose's father, had an unhealthy interest in children. I wonder why. And he did, at least on his own children. Several psychologists and criminologists would later report that it seems Bell Letts groomed Rose from prepubescence and started raping her likely between the ages of 10 and 12. He would rape her viciously and repeatedly, telling her, I made you and I'll do what I want with you. And the sad part of this is that this man is not the worst person in the story. It sounds an awful lot like Fred's dad, Walter, who was telling his daughters, it's my right as a father to do this to you. By 12, Rose was highly sexualized. She'd walk around the house fully nude and was also having incestuous relationships with her brothers. It's like a nightmare that keeps getting worse. The rumors of Bill's pedophilia caused them to move to Plymouth to avoid his now dicey reputation. At this time, Fred starts getting in trouble with the law, including an arrest at 19 for molesting a 13-year-old girl. He is reportedly shocked that this is a crime. He admits to police he's been molesting young girls since he was in his early teens and asks them, doesn't everyone do this? Like, that's in a police transcript. Fred was also arrested for several petty crimes, but would continue to molest young girls, including impregnating his sister and one of her friends who were both 13 and given abortions. These poor girls, like these poor children, like how do you grow up to possibly function when this is your starting point? Oh my God. Here we go. And there are reports that many women were raped between the ages of 12 to 14 by Fred during this time, who would later come forward after his subsequent arrest. At this exact time, the abuse in the Letts home reached an all-time high. Bill enjoyed figuring out new ways to torture his children, including chasing them around with knives and axes. People talk about the good old days, like, you know, why do people get divorced now and don't stay together like they did in the 50s and 60s? Dude, abuse was so common, even in the U.S. This was a common affair because in many ways, you wouldn't get in trouble for beating your wife or your kids. It was kind of your right. Like, the incestuous jump isn't that far in logic for how people justified abuse. Rose was being raped by her father and was being viciously bullied in school and started acting out sexually. Of course she did. She's been sexualized her whole life. She, like Fred, also started molesting her baby brother when she was 14 and he was 9 or 10. This is so freaking tragic. And it's like this domino effect of depraved people just passing their depravity to other people. It's just maddening. At this time, Fred marries an old girlfriend named Rena Costella, who at the time was pregnant with someone else's child. This didn't bother Fred, but he still got married. The only witness to their November 1962 wedding was Fred's equally rapey and terrible brother, John. More on him later. They relocate to Scotland, where Fred was reportedly insatiable. He would repeatedly rape Rena if she didn't want to have sex. He would aggressively pinch her during sex with the sole intent of harming her and leaving bruises. He would beat her viciously, and he would eventually force her into prostitution. In 1963, Rena gave birth to the baby girl, and here's a weird detail. She wrote to Fred's parents saying that her baby had died, and so instead, her and Fred had adopted a little girl to take her place. Why would you do that? Why would you make up this lie? Because the baby was mixed, and Fred's parents, in addition to being incestuous, abusive assholes, were super racist. Like, how do all of the worst people in the universe end up in one story? And that's how little Charmaine enters the family. Fred also hates Charmaine, not because she's another man's baby, but because she isn't white and Fred is garbage. During this time, Fred shockingly becomes an ice cream truck driver, which is incredibly terrifying. During this unbelievably toxic marriage, Fred had multiple affairs, impregnating several women. Rena was also having affairs, including with one of the bus drivers. I got to tell you, all the mistakes I've made in my life, as I go through this story, I'm like, you know what? I've made some bad choices, but I'm doing okay. Man, in 1965, somehow things get worse. Fred runs over a 4-year-old boy in his ice cream truck and kills him. An angry mob surrounds the truck, accusing him of reckless driving, but he's somehow released with no charges because police couldn't prove that it wasn't the kid's fault. After so much dysfunction, I can't include here because it would literally take me 3 episodes, Rena calls her bus driver boyfriend and asks for help to leave Fred. Unfortunately, Fred comes home unexpectedly and there is an all-out brawl. Fred eventually takes his girls, Charmaine and Anne-Marie, hostage to prevent them from leaving. He quickly finds a new lover, Anna McFall. Real quick, Fred does not fall into the category of not conventionally attractive. He falls strongly into the category of like conventionally ew and ladies, please cover your drinks. How is he getting these women? This is part of the story I don't understand. Like, he must have been the most charming human who has ever existed, because this man is not attractive. He's not in the ballpark of attractive. How? I don't understand. He, of course, gets Anna McFall pregnant immediately, and she pressures him to divorce Rena and marry him, which he refuses. In 1967, shortly before giving birth, Anna goes missing, and she is never seen again. When Fred was arrested in 1994, he would deny killing her, but this was proved false. He was the only person who knew the location of her remains. She was his first victim, and when she was later found, she'd been stabbed repeatedly, bound, and dismembered with many hand and feet bones missing, identical to what Fred would do to later victims. Anna was likely the birth of his MO, his first victim, and her body was found 27 years later, less than a mile from where they lived at the time. Somehow, he and Rena reconcile. Come on, Rena. During which time, a 15-year-old named Mary Bassome goes missing after waiting at a bus stop. She was a waitress at a cafe Fred frequented, and based on her look and the manner of her disappearance, it's very likely that she was his second victim. Even though Rose's mother attempted to leave Bill, Rose continued to be sexually promiscuous and eventually returned to her abuser, her father, because she missed him, including sexually. She had been so abused, she thought that this was normal. She was waiting at a bus stop to go to work at her job at a tea shop when the 27-year-old Fred showed up and won her over. He showered her with affection and gifts, and they start dating. This makes her father outrageously jealous, which is so gross. And he demands that she stop seeing Fred, but she refuses. She moves in with Fred and starts taking sex work clients in his caravan. Fred liked his women to participate in sex work, and Rose loved doing it. Yuck. When reported missing by her father in 1969, Rose, because she was still 15, is put in a home for troubled girls, and Fred spent some time in jail for failing to pay fines. So he goes to jail for not paying fines, but not for raping 13-year-olds. That's good to know. Fred's kids are put back in foster care, and Rose is allowed to leave the girls' home when she turns 16, and she moves in with Fred and his children. June of 1970. Fred and Rose moved to Gloucester, where they would live and commit their crimes for the next 24 years. Fred resorts again to petty theft to make rent. Rose gives birth to their first child, Heather Ann, on October 17th, 1970. And my God, this poor girl, this poor, beautiful child. Rose, now just 17, is adjusting to life with 3 kids. So she has Heather, and she has Fred's 2 kids, Charmaine and Anne-Marie, when Fred is arrested and jailed for 9 months. Again, he goes to jail for theft and fines, but not for the multiple sexual assaults. Unfortunately, even in the U.S. legal system, that hasn't changed that much. The percentage of rapists who go to jail is extremely low. According to the data from RAINN and other sources, out of every 1,000 rapes, only 310 are reported to the police. Of the reported cases, about 57 lead to an arrest, 13 are referred to prosecutors, 7 result in felony convictions, and only 6 perpetrators are incarcerated. So that is 6 per 1,000 rapists. This means that only 0.6% of rapists ever end up going to jail. These statistics highlight significant gaps in the criminal justice process for handling rape cases in the first place, with many cases not leading to arrests or convictions. Factors contributing to this include underreporting due to various reasons, including abuse, shame, all of these things. When you live in a puritanical culture where victims consistently get blamed for a crime, they're much less likely to report it. And there's the difficulty of proving sexual cases beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a very, very challenging crime to convict. Rose does not handle being alone well. She begins viciously beating her children, smashing them with bowls, beating them with wooden spoons, tying them to their beds, and the house becomes extremely filthy. In March of 1971, Rose takes Charmaine, now 8, to the hospital for a severe puncture wound on her ankle. Rose was especially brutal to Charmaine. And that was not because Charmaine was from a different relationship. It was because Charmaine wasn't white. It's just so unbelievably sad. After their second visit to Fred while he's in jail on June 15th, 1971, Charmaine goes missing. Rose had kept her home from school and murdered her. Rose told the school and anyone that would listen that Raina had come to get Charmaine, and they believed her. On June 24th, when Fred gets out of prison, he buries Charmaine's body behind the flat, saying he couldn't bring himself to dismember her because she was so young and pure, which is such a gross, weird thing for a dad to say. In 1994, Fred will reveal Charmaine's murder, and authorities will find her grave. Shortly after this, Rose becomes a full-time prostitute, and Fred drills a hole in the wall so he can watch. He would complain if she wasn't loud or enthusiastic enough, and if she met with a client when he couldn't be there, he would make her recount it to him in great detail, which is, such. And between he and Rose, they began to dabble in threesomes, toys, and hardcore BDSM. Rose at no point seemed to have any sexual qualms, despite some sources and even law enforcement initially believing that Fred was the sole driving force. It does seem clear now that Rose was every bit as into their actions and often a driving force herself. Many of her children would recount that she was often the more violent and the more sexually aggressive. Fred and Rose had an issue, though. Raina starts coming around, demanding to know where Charmaine is. Fred tells her, "I'll take you to Charmaine, but first, let's go get a drink." And when he does go get a drink with her, he walks her to the car and strangles her to death. Dead men tell no tales. Be careful who you share your life with. He dismembers her and buries her in a field, and her body would also be found in the 90s. In November of 1971, a single mother named Elizabeth Akeos moves into a home next to Fred and Rose. Her new neighbors were shockingly open about their arrangement and that they had sex with other people. Wink, wink, Elizabeth. In fact, at one point when Fred and Rose returned home, they told Elizabeth they had been driving around looking for girls aged 15 to 17 who could pass for a virgin, that they could move into their home and that they could become her pimp. Like, they just told their neighbor this. This is what we're doing. They later tell Elizabeth they would like to have a threesome with her, and she declines. Now, Elizabeth at this point should have reported them to the police and had nothing to do with them, and for some unknown reason, she doesn't do that. She's over visiting them, and they give her a drugged cup of tea, and they proceed to rape her while she's unconscious. Elizabeth never reported this until Fred and Rose's 94 arrest because she was afraid her husband would leave her if he found out that she had been raped, which is so sad. That regardless of what happened to get you in that situation, the guilt of an attack is 100% on the abuser. 100%. It's 100% on the abuser. I don't want to hear anything about a victim being to blame. They're not. They're not. But also to be like, you can't go to the closest person in your life because he's going to leave you because he found out you were assaulted is just extra sad. In January of 1972, Fred and Rose finally tie the knot. So they hadn't been married this whole time, just, raping people and having babies together. They decided they needed a bigger house for their family, and they wanted a separate section for prostitution, so they moved to 25 Cromwell Street, a place that would become so infamous for their crimes, it would be bulldozed later and nothing built in its place. I can't imagine anyone wanting to live there anyway. Fred turns the cellar of the new house into a sex and torture dungeon. The Wests also take in lodgers who rent rooms, and sometimes Rose will have sex with them. Okay, so I know it's hard to believe, but we're going to take a turn for the worst here. So it's going to get worse. At this time, they take Fred's daughter, Anna Marie, now 8, down to the cellar where Fred tells her he's going to help her and do his duty as a father. On the floor are sex toys and ligatures. Anna Marie cries as they forcefully remove her clothes and both of them actively rape her. I want to murder these people slowly, like drawn and quartered tar and feather. Anna Marie is warned that she will be severely punished if she tells anyone, but that she shouldn't be upset because this is normal and families do it all the time. Shortly after, they bind Anna Marie to a torture device before raping her again and forcing her to take hot salt baths, which caused her a lot of pain. In November of 1972, so keep in mind that this has all happened in a very short time frame. They met in 1969. So this escalation is flying fast. As Fred and Rose are driving, they see a teenager, Caroline Owens, hiking along the road. They offer to hire the 17-year-old as a live-in nanny, which she accepts, and soon realizes she's not working for a normal couple. She notices they touch her a lot. Rose seems to accidentally barge in on her while she's bathing. Fred talks openly and explicitly about sex with her, and there were apparently also orgies at the house between the Wests and the lodgers. So much ick. Ugh. Caroline finally runs away. She's 17. She's like, She's like, this is weird. I don't like it. She runs away. And like normal people, the Wests make a plan to abduct her and get her back. And on December 26th of 1972, they do just that. They offer Caroline a ride from her boyfriend's house, which she accepts. Like, they didn't necessarily leave on bad terms. Caroline left because she got skeeved out. She's like, sure, I'll take the ride. It's December. It's cold. It's wet. Rose climbs into the back seat and immediately starts groping and fondling Caroline. Caroline pushes her away, but Rose continues to assault her. Fred drives to a remote location, beats Caroline unconscious, and when she wakes up, she's still in the car, but now she's bound and gagged. They take her to the house, throw her on the mattress of the cellar, and repeatedly and brutally rape her. Fred beats her with a buckle and tells her, I'll keep you in the cellar and let my friends have you, and when we're finished, we'll kill you and bury you under the paving stones. He said it like he had done it before, and it would become a very dark prediction. The next day, Fred is like, hey, my bad. I'm sorry. It was a little aggressive. It was totally Rose's idea. But hey, would you like to come work for us again? And Caroline is a motherfucking G right now. This girl is so smart. I cannot commend her enough, and it saves her life. She takes Fred's threats at his word, and she knows if she refuses to nanny for them, they're going to kill her. So she's like, of course, no problem. Of course I'll stay. She agrees to stay. She cleans the house. She plays with the kids. And when Fred and Rose aren't paying attention, she gets the fuck out of there. This girl held it together and probably gave the acting performance of her life, and it saved her. When someone is abusive, just a little side note, take their threats seriously. Even when it's like, they would never do that, they were just mad. Take their threats seriously. They've thought it through. Otherwise, they wouldn't say it. I know sometimes in abusive situations where people are like, oh, they didn't mean it. They just lost control of their emotions. Really? Do they lose control of their emotions with their boss or with their friends? No? Then maybe controlling their emotions isn't the problem. When Caroline's mother sees the bruising, she calls police immediately, and Fred, now 31, and Rose, 19, are arrested. They confess to police about the assault, but because Caroline is too terrified to testify, they're only charged with indecent assault causing bodily harm, and they are fined 25 pounds each and allowed to go free. It's such a testament to the fact that many men in the justice system do not see sexual assault as a big deal. Caroline is so devastated by the decision that she attempts to take her own life, but thankfully survives. And let me tell you, there are so many children who will commit suicide and attempt to commit suicide because of these two fucks. Now, while they had received no punishment for what they just did, they do decide that maybe in the future it's better to kill their victims so that they don't risk getting in trouble. Linda Go, a young seamstress, goes missing on April 19th of 1973. She was raped, murdered, and decapitated and buried in the garage. Murder number 6, collectively, for the West. Rose was 5 months pregnant at this time. When Linda's mother, June, recognized Rose as someone Linda had gotten drinks with, she questioned Rose about it, and Rose initially lies, says she doesn't know Linda, and then June points out, "You're wearing Linda's slippers." And she also noticed Linda's clothes on the line. Rose told June that Linda had stayed over, but left, and she didn't know where she went. Rose, being the same age as Linda, June believed her. Carol Ann Cooper, a 15-year-old in 1973, was going through a family divorce, and after movie, she was picked up by Fred and Rose West, who used the ruse as the sweet married couple to lure girls into the car. They bound her and sexually tortured her and murdered her. Fred then again decapitated, dismembered, and buried the body, same as he's done since his first crime. Lucy Partington, an upper-middle-class 21-year-old university student, left to catch the bus after visiting a friend and was never seen again. Lucy, a devout Catholic, would not have gone willingly to some sexual encounter, and later, based on a confession by Fred, was kept in their basement for 7 days. Lucy became victim number 8 and was disposed of in Fred West fashion. Just absolute monsters. In 1974, Therese Singlethaler was on her way to Ireland and she vanished. She soon joined the same fate as the other girls. On November 14th, 1974, 15-year-old Shirley Lloyd, a beautiful girl headed home from a date, was abducted from a bus stop, and the Wests were much crueler to her. Like most sexual sadists, they tend to get crueler and more vicious over time. They wrapped Shirley's entire head in duct tape, inserting a straw so that she could breathe before repeatedly raping and beating her and then murdering and dismembering her body. Victim number 10, 4 of which are buried in the cellar. And the police have no leads on these missing women. On April 11th, 1975, Juanita Mott, abducted on her way to babysit for a friend, became victim number 11. In 1976, as if these two can't get any fucking worse, they start befriending girls at a troubled girls group home. Young girls, very young girls. They listen to them, they're kind to them, they feed them in order to lure more and more girls into the home. They also become foster parents. Both the foster girls and the girls from the group home are groomed before Rose makes sexual advances, and then Fred. If the girls do not reciprocate the flirting or the advances, they were raped. There is an uncountable amount of young girls that were raped during this time. These rapes often included vicious physical beatings. They always prey on the most vulnerable, like girls from troubled homes, foster kids. They have nowhere to go. They don't want to be on the street. You guys remember Anna Marie? As she hits puberty, the abuse escalates. She's prevented from having access to tampons or pads for no other reason than to humiliate her. She's forced to bathe in scalding hot water that burns her. She's beaten with sticks, stabbed, locked in the cellar. Fred at one point makes a chastity belt with a vibrator in it for Anne Marie. She's a fucking kid. She's a teenager. Eventually, Anna Marie starts to have trouble in school. Of course she is. Then they force her into prostitution. Britain doesn't have the death penalty, but they certainly should for people like this. Rose starts taking used condoms from her clients to Fred, who tries to use them to artificially inseminate Anna Marie. Why? Nobody fucking knows. Rose becomes pregnant again by one of her clients, and Fred gets a prostitute pregnant. What is happening? The prostitute, Shirley Robinson, magically goes missing weeks before her birth, and the first dismembered body ends up in the garden. This is victim number 12 if you're counting, and they would kill at least 2 more. In 1979, Rose began advertising her sex services indiscriminately and installed a special doorbell for customers to ring when they would come to the house. One of her regular customers was her father. Dear old daddy dad is coming to ring the hooker bell. I'm going to smash a window. Fred continues to rape Anne Marie and he gets her pregnant, and Rose takes her to get an abortion. Like, at least thank God she didn't have to carry that. August 15th, 1979, Allison Chambers fled from the children's home and ran to Fred and Rose West. Shortly before her 17th birthday, she was raped, tortured, murdered, and buried in the garden. Anna Marie, now 15, is progressively more and more afraid of her life as she approaches 16, which is when you can basically legally remove yourself from your parents' home. And she finally flees for her life and goes to stay with friends. Thank God. Rose continues to have kids with clients, and the kids are strictly controlled to prevent secrets from getting out. With Anne Marie gone, Fred turns his sexual interest to 10-year-old Heather and 8-year-old May. Did I mention I want to murder this man, like, slowly and painfully over the course of several months? Heather becomes withdrawn and depressed, of course, failing in school. Because she hates her father raping her, her parents are convinced she's a lesbian, and they're furious about it, which doesn't make any sense because Rose is bisexual. After having 8 children, Rose, now 30, becomes increasingly more violent to the children, beating them viciously. In 1985, Heather, like Anne Marie, becomes increasingly worried about what happens when she turns 16. So she begins studying for a certificate of secondary education to try to give herself a way out. Anne Marie is now married and living safely away from the family. In 1986, as Heather is sitting for exams, she finally opens up to her friend Denise Harrison about what's going on at home. And in 1987, Heather keeps trying to find a job and is decreasingly depressed when she keeps getting turned down. She just wants out. On a rainy day in 1987, Fred tries to assault Heather again, and she fights back. She ends up in a fight with both of her parents, and they strangle her. It's never determined who actually killed her. It's believed it was Fred that strangled her, and Rose stomped her head to make sure she was dead. She was then dismembered, decapitated, and buried. He tells the kids that Heather found a job, and he had one of his sons, Stephen, dig a hole in the yard under the pretense of installing a pond. When the son later sees the hole filled in, he knows he just helped bury his sister. It becomes a family joke or a threat that if you misbehave, you'd end up 2 down and 3 across, in reference to the burial place of Heather. Fred and Rose continue to engage in sex work and molesting and probably murdering. While we don't have bodies from the time frame between 1987 and the early 1990s, they most likely didn't stop cold turkey. And then finally, in 1992, something good happens. A 13-year-old girl reports abuse by the Wests and reports being raped by Fred. Finally, Fred and Rose West are under investigation. Investigators serve a warrant for evidence of child abuse, including pornography, and boy, do they hit the mother load. 90 videos of explicit pornography alone. On February 25th, 1994, Fred and Rose are finally arrested. Constable Hazel Savage, which is the best last name of a constable ever, begins interviewing friends and family, including Anna Marie, who is now the mother of 2 daughters herself. And she tells them everything, including the suspicious circumstances around her mother, Rena, and her half-sister, Charmaine. Go, Anna Marie. Anna Marie's husband tells Savage she needs to talk to Heather if she can find her. Savage interrogates Rose about Heather's whereabouts, and she frequently changes her story about why she never reported Heather or why she never looked for her, including saying that she didn't want her younger children exposed to a lesbian. Being exposed to orgies, prostitution, BDSM, rape, murder, all fine. Lesbians, though, that's where we draw the line. Fred is held in jail as a level 43 prisoner, which is sex offenders, and even after Rose's attempted suicide, she's allowed to live at home because it's not yet believed that she was heavily involved. The idea that the woman can't possibly be so perverted and so violent. In the fall of 1992, one of the West children, now in foster care, admits that Fred had threatened them with violence if they ever talked about what happened in the house and that they would be killed and buried under the patio, just like their sister Heather. For some reason, the social worker does not report this. On June 7th of 1993, Fred is charged with 3 counts of rape, 1 count of buggery, and 1 count of cruelty to a child, and Rose is charged with cruelty and inciting him to have sex with a minor. Unfortunately, at the last minute, the 13-year-old witness decides not to testify, and Fred and Rose are declared not guilty. This just goes to show you that just because someone gets away with it doesn't mean it didn't happen, especially in sexual assault cases that are so hard to prove. Hazel Savage, however, was not going to let the disappearance of Heather slide. And in early 1994, a West child again says they can't talk about what happened at home because Fred will kill them and bury them under the patio. Hazel is finally informed of this and the information, and February 23rd, 1994, she gets a warrant to search for bodies. They finally find the human remains. By March 1st, Fred is arrested for murder, and between March 5th and 8th, they find 6 more bodies, all extensively mutilated and sexually abused. By April 25th, Rose is finally charged with murder as well. And on May 6th, they are both charged with 5 counts of murder. Fred then confesses to the murder of the Cromwell Street bodies, the murder of Raina and Charmaine, and knowing the location of the remains of Anne McFall, 1967. This confession is extremely important later. December 13th, 1994, Fred and Rose see each other for the last time. Rose briefly glances at him before ignoring him the entire hearing. Rose had believed that Fred would take the blame, and when that didn't happen, she was done with him and refused to speak to him. On January 1st, 1995, Fred Rose hung himself with a rope that he had made from a blanket. He claims to have committed at least 30 murders, and authorities can confirm at least 13. He left behind a suicide note that read, "Well, Rose, it's your birthday on 29 November 1994, and you will be 41 and still beautiful and still lovely, and I love you. We will always be in love. The most wonderful thing in my life was when I met you. Our love is special to us. So, love, keep your promises to me. You know what they are? Where we are put together forever and ever is up to you. We loved Heather, both of us. I would love Charmaine to be with Heather and Raina. You will always be Mrs. West all over the world, and that is important to me and to you. I haven't got you a present, but all I have is my life. I will give it to you, my darling. When you are ready, come to me, and I will be waiting for you." And beside that being super cringy and gross, I hate how these cowards will torture people their entire lives. But as soon as they have to go to jail, as soon as they have to experience any kind of suffering or inconvenience, they off themselves like a bunch of cowards. Oh, and remember Fred's brother John? Well, shortly after Fred's death, he also hung himself while waiting on a verdict on charges of multiple rapes of his niece, Fred's daughter, Anna Marie, who he raped over 300 times. I am so thankful that these pieces of human garbage are finally dying. Rose West's trial begins on October 3rd, 1995. She is now facing charges for 10 counts of murder. Charmaine West's murder was added to hers because Fred was in jail at the time, and they know only Rose could have done it. She is convicted of all 10 and receives multiple life sentences with no chance of parole. West is currently an inmate at HM Prison Newhall, Flockton, West Yorkshire. She is 70 years old and in good health, unfortunately. I hope she dies painfully. Jesus. Okay. Before today's travel portion, let's review today's episode with today's highway highlights. Fred and Rose West murdered at least 3 members of their own family and at least 9 others. Number 2, their childhoods were one of sadistic abuse, incest, rape, and torture that they in turn perpetuated on others. Number 3, Fred and Rose's life and crimes were punctuated by an extreme perversion in every sense of the word. Rape, child abuse, reckless endangerment, sexual torture. The fact that Fred killing a 4-year-old in his ice cream truck is one of the least heinous things he did is telling to how truly horrific they both were. Number 4, Many of Fred and Rose's children did attempt to commit suicide, as well as Raina's daughter Anna Marie. Many were unsuccessful, but one of their younger sons was able to commit suicide in 2011. I could not have made up a story that egregious if I tried. Like, if I put my mind to making an evil story, I couldn't have done it. But we're going to go into something lighter now. We are in the travel portion. I love London. I've visited multiple times. I lived there for part of 2019. And London is obviously not the scene directly of the crimes, but this is where you'd fly into to reach that region. So that's what we're going to focus on. And if you've never been to London, it's a great place to start seeing Europe. If you really you don't know where to go first, London is amazing. There's so much incredible history, so much to see and do. There's great public transit, and it's one of my favorite places in Europe. So grab a drink, take a deep breath, and let's talk travel. So because of the nature of London and just its rich history, a lot of the travel destinations I'm going to focus on today are a little bit more historical landmarks. The first one is my favorite. It's my favorite place to go in London. It's a little morbid, but the Tower of London. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I have a picture that I took of the tower at night. And the Tower of London was founded by William the Conqueror in 1066. And it's one of the most famous fortified buildings in the world. It's over 1,000 years old. And this is one of the places that survived the Blitz really incredibly. It's also very notorious as a prison. Anne Boleyn was imprisoned here. Sir Thomas More, Elizabeth I, Lady Jane Grey was executed here, and the crown jewels have been housed there since the 14th century. So, despite like this kind of grim, morbid history, on the outside of the tower, there's this hill you walk up where they used to host their public executions. They would walk the prisoners out, walk up the hill. Everybody's there on their picnic blankets because that's what crazy people did back then. And then your whole family would get to watch someone's head get chopped off. But the history is really incredible. You actually get led on tour by a group of soldiers called the Yeoman Warders or the Beef Eaters. They're a very special segmented group of the British military, and a soldier takes you through the history of the London Tower, the dungeons, everything. It's really incredible. And one of the things that the Tower of London really made me appreciate about British history is that they're very honest about it. They're very honest about the shitty things that the British Empire did, that the crazy kings and queens did. Like, they're still very proud to be British, but they're like, hey, here's all these horrible, horrible things that happened. Here's the story. Very incredible. Also, for my creepy people, this location is incredibly haunted. So definitely go see the Tower of London first. The next place I'm going to bring up is Buckingham Palace. And I'm typically a kind of person that kind of gets annoyed with the obsessions with the royals. I'm like, wait, didn't we beat them though? But Buckingham Palace is particularly beautiful. It's really interesting to see the level of importance that the guards show guarding this area. Buckingham Palace was built in 1703 as a large townhouse for the Duke of Buckingham. It became the official London residence of the British monarch in 1837 with the accession of Queen Victoria. The coolest thing to see here is, in my opinion, the changing of the guards. You can tour the staterooms, but watching the changing of the guards, and this is also like where people try to make the guards smile or laugh or whatever. It's really just interesting to see. It's kind of interesting to see the years of tradition play out in front of you. So I blew this picture up just because I love old churches. I think they're so beautiful. My next recommendation for things like, you must see this. If you've got limited time, go to Westminster Abbey. It's one of the oldest and most notable religious buildings in the United Kingdom. It traces back to the 7th century when a small Benedictine monastery was established. The current Gothic structure that you see in pictures, and you'll see these online when I get the Instagram going, was built by King Henry III in 1245. He wanted to be buried here. It's been the coronation church for the English and British monarchs since the coronation of William the Conqueror in 1066. And additionally, it's been the site of numerous royal weddings. Also, so one of the things that I loved when I first went into Westminster Abbey, because the first time I went to London, I didn't have time to go in. I just walked around the outside. I'm like, oh, it's so pretty. Came back, went inside. First of all, it's beautiful, as many of these churches are. And along the floor, there's so many people buried in and under the abbey. As you walk along the floor, you'll see the names of people that are buried in that spot, whether it's in like a coffin or under the floor. Some of the famous people, so Edward the Confessor is buried here, Henry III, Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots. A lot of famous poets and writers are buried here: Geoffrey Chaucer, Charles Dickens, Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin are both buried here, as well as missionaries like David Livingstone. The Poets' Corner is actually it's a super famous section of Westminster, but it's also my favorite portion. And it's built to honor many of Britain's literary greats. And it's a truly, truly magical experience. That's going to be, again, this is not a site that you want to miss when you go to see London. And I've included these next two together simply because in a lot of this, if you're by Westminster Abbey, you're pretty close to Big Ben, and you're also pretty close to the London Eye. So the London Eye is also known as Millennium Wheel. It's the giant Ferris wheel that's on the south bank of the River Thames, and it was designed by David Marks and Julia Barfield and was opened to the public in March 9th of 2000. It's 135 meters tall, which is 443 feet, and it was the world's tallest Ferris wheel until 2006. What I love about the London Eye, and this is not something you don't need to go ride the Ferris wheel. It's cool to see because it's just this interesting juxtaposition of you have this river in front of it. It's against this big urban setting, and there's just this big ass Ferris wheel. And right across the river is Big Ben. The nickname, it's for the great bell of the clock of the north end of the Palace of Westminster. So Westminster Abbey, Big Ben, they're right there together. The tower was designed by Augustus Pugin and completed in 1859 as part of Charles Barry's design for the new Palace of Westminster after the old one was destroyed in a fire in 1834. It's 315 feet tall, and the tower was renamed the Elizabeth Tower in 2012 in honor of Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee. The clock is famous for its reliability and its distinctive chimes, which have become a symbol of the United Kingdom. And this is one of those things where I had no interest in seeing Big Ben when I went to London. But once I got there, I'm like, this is actually really interesting. It also really makes me think of Harry Potter. I don't know why. I have that association. Very beautiful, very iconic. Again, you can go into the tower if you want to, but it's in this same area. But stop by and at least look at it. It's really cool. It's really interesting. There's great pubs in this area, and I don't have one in particular because I've been to so many of them, but great pubs with like local ales, different types of beers, scotches, and like really good fish and chips. It's a great spot. My next recommendation is the Shard. So the Shard is over 1,000 feet tall. It features 11,000 glass panels, and it has this really distinct glimmering appearance. It's this sharp, pointed skyscraper. Again, very iconic if you've seen pictures of London. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's the building standing to it would be my left. And then this other picture is my view from the Shard. So the Shard is a mixed-use building. It has offices. It's got a beautiful restaurant on one of the upper floors that I would absolutely recommend. It's called The View from the Shard. It's beautiful. So this picture on my right is the picture I took from having dinner there. And then the little red circle that I circled, that's the Tower of London. It's really become a symbol of modern London. This restaurant was amazing. This is by far the nicest place that I've been to in London as far as restaurants. Actually, I was on a very romantic date there. Let's just put it that way. So absolutely go to the Shard, go to the restaurant. This would be your fancy meal. Remember, I'm always telling you, take a trip, have at least one nice meal. It's going to happen in the Shard. And depending on how much time you have in London, something that I did when I was living there was took a train to Cambridge. And so Cambridge is the home of Cambridge, the university. Really interesting, like very old town. It's a university town. It is a phenomenal day trip. The river runs through the city, and there's restaurants that like you can eat like over the river. And it has history going all the way back to the medieval period, and you can see it when you walk around. Just amazing. Also, randomly, I was walking through Cambridge, and I was coming down the street. We were headed to go get lunch, and there's a man playing a banjo in a trash can. So I'm not really sure what that was about. I feel like that's not Cambridge standard. But if you have the time, get on a train. One of the great things about Europe that they've done really well is traveling within Europe and especially within a country, is usually super affordable. They've got trains, they've got public transit. You can get a flight from like London to Germany for like $40. It's unreal. I can't get a flight from Nashville to Atlanta for $40. So definitely go to Cambridge if you have time. And then I'm going to talk to you really quick about a very, very special bar. So I mentioned early in the episode that I was going to talk about Jack the Ripper a little bit, and this is where I'm going to focus. This is going to be my primary focus for bars today. I just want to take the time to lean into London history with this episode. The 10 Bells Pub. It's located on 84 Commercial Street in Spitalfields, East London, and it is one of the most famous and historic public houses, which is where the word pub comes from. And it's renowned for its association with Jack the Ripper. So the pub dates back to 1752 is when they estimate when it really opened. And it was named Eight Balls Ale House back at the time. It was named after the 8 bells of Christ Church. It was later renamed the 10 Bells to reflect the addition of 2 more bells that were added to that church. So the Jack the Ripper connection, the 10 Bells, is infamously linked to him and the murders of 1888. Several victims, including Annie Chapman, Mary Jane Kelly, were known to frequent the pub. Mary Jane Kelly was believed to be the Ripper's final victim, was last seen alive near this pub. And the pub's association with this gruesome events has kind of cemented its place in Ripper lore. It's also believed that this was his local pub. So when he wanted to go out and get a drink and hang with the boys, he went to 10 Bells Pub. It's long been reputed to be super haunted. Patrons and staff have reported seeing ghostly figures. They hear unexpected noises, the feeling of sudden drops in temperature. And I'm actually getting goosebumps because when I was in 10 Bells, I was sitting on the far side of the bar getting a drink. I just wanted one drink to say I had been there. And this is the middle of summer. It's warm, it's sunny, it's balmy. Yes, London is super rainy, but in the late summer, it's beautiful. And I'm sitting there just having a beer, and all of a sudden I get so cold, I feel like I need a coat. To the point where you massage your hands when they're cold. It got very, very cold for 8 minutes, and then it just was warm again. One of the most frequently reported apparitions is that of an old man dressed in Victorian-era clothing. This ghost is often seen on the upper floors of the pub, where he is said to emit an eerie presence. There's another spectral figure that's believed to be Annie Chapman, which is one of Jack the Ripper's victims. Witnesses have claimed to see her ghost inside the pub as well as out on Commercial Street. The 10 Bells has been the subject of several ghost hunter investigations. They've called all kinds of teams in, TV shows, all kinds of things, using different techniques to capture evidence of the supernatural activity. Some have reported capturing strange sounds and images on their equipment. Obviously, because of the 10 Bells connection to Jack the Ripper, it's a super popular pub. It's probably going to be busy anytime that you go, but it is so worth it. It's just a really, really beautiful place. And one of the things I love about London is just the iconicness of pub culture. So you have to go to the 10 Bells. The second bar I'm going to recommend is a place called Satan's Whiskers. And when you go up to this place, it seems incredibly unpretentious. It's not put on. The atmosphere inside is much different than the outside, but I will tell you that this is one of the best cocktail bars in the world. They win awards for their cocktails every single year. It's a really cool environment, and it's not super expensive compared to a lot of very upper echelon cocktail bars. This one is not only top notch, but super affordable. And last on the bar recommendations, I'm going to recommend the Seed Library. So this is over in Shoreditch. Again, because we know me now. If you listen to my episodes, you know I love speakeasies. I love anything that has a speakeasy vibe. And the Seed Library is a little bit more of a speakeasy vibe, but again, very elevated upper echelon cocktails and a lot of interesting things that I had never seen before. So I'm typically bourbon, whiskey, scotch. Those are the things I prefer to have. But they had a lot of really interesting flavors here. One of the things that someone had kept telling me to try was a black fruit fizz salad. Again, obviously this is food, it's not cocktails, but just super interesting. That's not something I would have ever ordered or normally gotten on my own. The whole place is very friendly, very welcoming. Absolutely cannot recommend the Seed Library enough. And let's talk about food. So a lot of times when people think British food, they either don't know what to think because they're like, well, what is British food? Or they think of things like fish and chips, which we will talk about. But actually, one of England's national dishes is chicken tikka masala. And a lot of this is reflecting the multicultural influences in England, but it comes from the relationship that Great Britain had with the East India Trading Company. The East India Trading Company brought in lots of spices and different flavor profiles. And then post-World War II, there was a huge immigration coming in from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and it introduced a variety of South Asian dishes to Great Britain. Like the stupid part of my brain likes to think about like these old-timey British people that like think everyone else is heathens and they're like, oh my God, we can put something on our bland chicken, but Indian food. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to talk about a neighborhood. So if you're in London, there's a place called Tooting. It's a neighborhood. That's what it's actually called. This is the best area to find good Indian food. Like you can just go to that neighborhood and basically choose an Indian restaurant that's in your price range and it's going to knock it out of the park. Another super common food that when you think of London is fish and chips. So my favorite recommendation for this is Hobson's Fish and Chips in Soho. Very unpretentious, very casual, and I'm not a big fish person. So this for me was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to branch out. I'm going to give it a try, but it was actually incredibly delicious. I have a picture here. Again, simple. It's just fries, a really nicely fried piece of fried fish with some tartar sauce. 10 out of 10. I'm going to do a couple more places before I wrap up today. I'm really trying to keep this episode underneath an hour and a half. I'm someone who loves music. I love the arts. I love the theater. And I would absolutely recommend going to the Globe. So the Globe that you'll see now is not the original Globe that stood when Shakespeare was alive. The original one was destroyed. The original one was built in 1599 by Lord Chamberlain's men, which included William Shakespeare, and really became like the theater to go to. The Globe was located in Southwark on the south bank of the River Thames in London, which was already known for its entertainment venues. The Globe was a three-story open-air amphitheater with a circular shape and could accommodate about 3,000 people. In 1613, a fire during the performance of Shakespeare's Henry VIII ignited the thatched roof and caused the theater to burn down completely. Like, remarkably, there was no fatalities, nobody died, but the Globe was reconstructed in 1614, and this time with a tiled roof to reduce the risk of fire. In 1642, the Puritans, because they're always spoiling everybody's fun, disapproved of public entertainment because God doesn't want us to have joy. They closed all the theaters in London, including the Globe. In 1644, the theater was demolished to make room for tenements. So, once we got rid of the Puritans, the modern Globe theater that you would go see today is called Shakespeare's Globe. It's the brainchild of American actor Sam Wanamaker, and his vision was to create basically an exact replica of what was built when Shakespeare was alive. And construction for this Globe began in 1987, was completed in 1997, and they did so much research to make this as historically accurate as possible. And it was opened in 1997 by a performance of William Shakespeare's Henry VIII, which I thought was a really cool historical nod to the building. Really so much history about Shakespeare, his importance to literature. You can watch live plays there. You can tour it, learn the history about it. Just the interesting role that theater played in the 1600s, and the relationship between nobility and peasants, and how theater at first was considered something like immoral and gross. And it's a really cool part of history, and I would absolutely recommend seeing it. And since you'll be near the Globe, another thing that London is famous for is tea. The stuff we threw in the harbor. So afternoon tea is like a very rich cultural tradition for them. It's just snacks, small sandwiches, sweets, really delicious tea. There's a place actually near the Globe called Swan, and that is the best afternoon tea I've ever had in London. I will say with the Swan, I did not check to see if they're still open. Actually, they just popped into my head right now. But if they're still open, it's so incredible. I've had tea all over London. I've had different forms of it. This was the best one. All right. That is the Highway to Hell episode on London. I hope you enjoyed our first international episode. I will be uploading pictures from moving forward because I'm going to have social media dedicated just to the podcast. I'm going to be uploading pictures to those social media pages, and so you can see them if there's someone that doesn't watch on YouTube. And I hope you, it's hard to say enjoyed this episode because it was so brutal, but thank you for being here with me. Again, thank you so much for the notes and the messages and the likes and the follows. It's so encouraging for me. It's such a fun project. Very excited to keep this going. I have more active travel coming up in the next few weeks, kind of intermingled with places that I've just built episodes on with previous travel. Very thankful for you. Thank you for rolling down the highway with me, and I will see you next week for our episode of Highway to Hell.